what we're going to be discussing today is about not just the what, but the how. And I think when we talk about stabilization and what we've read in the review, a lot of what comes back to is how do we make sure an integrated approach is happening not just simply at the policy level, but that's able to then translate down all the way to the tactical levels. And so we've got very, very good experience up here today who can speak to that topic on a set of questions, and then we'll open it up for your questions so we can have a bigger discussion on this topic. So just so we know who's who, we don't have name tents. We'll just have each of our panelists introduce themselves, and then we'll kick off a round of questions.
Hi, Jason Ladnier with State CSO.
Tony Thacker with Central Command.
Kim Field with Creative Associates.
Chuck Burnett, 9th Civil Affairs Brigade.
Great, thank you. All right, so
One more.
that's it. That's it. They don't need to know more. They'll dig if they want to. So we all know each other anyways. It's a very small community. So, all right. One of the things, as we've talked about over and over again, and does anybody remember after this morning's keynote panel, what is the one thing you're supposed to remember? It's a political endeavor, right? So when we talk about stabilization being a political endeavor, there is especially that it's also civ-mil in order to get that, civil military, to achieve a political endeavor. We have to look at our own lessons learned. There's certainly a myriad of lessons learned that are out there, and a lot of those were part of this review. Panelists, from your own experience, what would you say is one of the major U.S. government reforms that needs to take place in order for us to achieve and sort of get to that political endeavor piece of the definition? Over to you.
Good. So let me first thank you, Kevin, and thanks to the sponsors and the hosts. Let me beg a caveat. I'm a firm believer that to have reform, you have to be critical and you have to know the challenges. I will say things that, if taken out of context, may be overly harsh to my civilian and military colleagues. Don't quote me out of context. It comes from a place of love and a place of trying to do this better. At the end of the day, and relate to that, I firmly believe that most people don't wake up in the morning thinking that he or she's going to come to work being a jerk, or whatever word you want to use that day. I believe that we're all in systems and we have incentives and we have degrees of empowerment, and the incentive structures we have and the ways in which we're empowered, I think, are the name of the game for both the SAR realizing its potential and for good civ-mil lash-up. I don't think that when people first were thinking about CERT that they thought, I'm going to incentivize people and grade them on their ability to push money out the door, and I'm going to grade them on that. I don't think that was the thought, but that was how the system played out. That's how, and similarly on civilian side, the dollars for state aid programs. That wasn't the start, but it became the way in which we talked about how are we doing our progress. It was how much money have we pushed out the door, how many people have we pushed out the door, and that became a distraction to the political, and so reforms need to be about how we incentivize, what we grade people on. Both civilians and military came oftentimes for a year or even 9 months to a theater, and their fit rep or their EER was, how'd you do? And it wasn't, oh, I picked up the ball on the 30-yard line and moved it to the 39-yard line and I had a good handoff. It was, no, my predecessor was an idiot. Whatever he or she did was completely wrong. I turned it around, and I had success in my 9 months or my year. That's not happening, but that's how the incentives structure played out. And then on the empowerment issue, we did a disservice whenever we put a civilian downrange with a military partner and did not provide that civilian with clear policy, directions, decision-making authority, maybe decisions over the assistance that their military colleagues thought they had control over, the ability to say to their military colleagues, I'm reaching back up the chain, and my chief of mission is going to be able to poke that political elite at a higher level to have an effect downrange. Whenever you don't set up that, if you don't empower both sides of your partnership, you're going to have a mismatch in that. And so I think, for me, over the course of this conversation, you're going to hear me talk about the ways in which our systems don't necessarily set up people throughout the tiers to be the most effective.
Okay. Also, Kevin, I appreciate the opportunity and for the host here. A couple things with points mentioned, and then when we look at reform, You know, I was thinking this morning, they talked about the 3Ds and in the morning piece, and I just relate to when we watch a 3D movie, right? It's looking at the whole perspectives. When you pull one of those elements out, you're in a two-dimension or a single-dimension view. And what I think the big thing that the SAR does is actually bring a viewpoint of how we look at three different things to look at the whole holistic picture. If you pull one of those viewpoints out, you're not going to get the whole picture. Let me give you an example. In Syria, just as a very small element, I had teams in Syria, and quite a while, over 2 years before we had our first DOS and USAID folks inside Syria. In Shaddadi, we've had Department of State and USAID make one trip for 3 hours there. And I've had people there since August 6th of last year, staying at that place. So who understands that governance, economics, the marketplace? And so really, it's how we start that DOS and USAID in the lead and the lead implementer, which we want to be. We are the ones that endorse my boss, General Votel, to go directly to the Secretary of State to make sure they got there because we want the partnership. And at the same time, understand there's a perspective of teams that are out there in non-permissive environments that have a great capability to understand the environment. So the first thing with problem solving is understanding the problem. And what's happened often is that we haven't understood the problem. And so we need all three elements to understand the problem, from the tactical level and on the ground, the whole way through the policy level. And my commander, the GCC commander, just for a lot of people who don't understand, he has unique authorities. He's the only person other than the Secretary of State that can talk to all 20 countries' head of state. This week, he's talked to 3 heads of state already. So he's also working ability to look at from the lowest level up through the political level into the NSC and to the president. So he reports to the General Master and the president. And so we have a unique, why we should be in the discussion and how we should look at it is from that point of view. And just as you mentioned, when you look at wasted programs of the past, of course, look at USAID's wasted money and US wasted money, and the same thing with the SERP. And when it came to the SERP, I was always that person that said, money's a weapon system, and we gave money to people who didn't understand to use a weapon system. I've been in the military a long time. I was E7 before I became an officer. I started in the Ranger Regiment and moved to different parts of our special operations. Every weapon that the military gave me, they taught me how to use it before I implemented it. When it came to SERP, you just told every commander who has no cultural training, no understanding of the environment, and say, hey, try to do good things and kickstart something. So it wasn't the SERP that was wrong, it's that we didn't know how to implement it to people who are trained and understand the environment to get something out of that. So as we look forward with the SAR and changing things directly to your question, it's how do we come together to change from the DC level the whole way down, that it takes a 3-tier approach. And the last thing is, when at a country level, when I was used to send special operations teams inside a country, I would take the integrated country strategy, the CDCS from USAID, and the theater, the TCP, the theater campaign plan, and I would go to ambassador and say, hey, this is your number 2, USAID, this is your number 3, and this is our number 1. And try to synchronize it at that country level. And I think oftentimes we do a pretty good job of that. And yet here at the policy level, when we're looking at Syria and Yemen, I have people in Yemen that DOS and USAID doesn't. And so how do we get together at this level, at the policy level, to say, hey, let's come together to use that 3D model and put those assessments together. We have a great unique capability, and let's all use that together. Yeah, now the brains.
I want to address one reform. I think that, as Tony just said, it's many dimensions. It all needs to work together. So I'd like to talk about one big reform on each of those levels, and if I take a little too much time, I'll give some up with the other questions, Kevin, I promise. Okay, so, Jason, so the first is a bit philosophical. It's just like Jason talked about. When we started this thing, and it did start about 20 months ago, really, with this transition books. The only reason I bring that up, because it's important to acknowledge the spirit in which it was developed, and it was amazing. We had all of these people who were willing to live by the adage, it's amazing what you can get done if it doesn't matter who gets credit, right? And it was just a remarkable group to be part of. We had some real experience, stabilization, believers, and wisdom conveyors in that group. Looking around the room, so many were there. We had PKSOI involved with Ryan McKenna, I don't know if he's in here, with Tammy Fitzgerald. We just had Rob Jenkins was right there. We had OSD. It was just fantastic. And I feel like there was a sense that a rising tide will lift all ships, so that this idea that you have to hang on to your resources, your own agency's resources at all costs, was somehow set aside to start this thing. I feel like that attitude is inside the SAR now, and it will be absolutely critical going forward. So that is the political, I know it's all touchy-feely kind of nonsense that, Tony would absolutely hate, but, it is critical. I'd like to hit on another point that's sometimes neglected, and that's institutional. Now, Jason, he teaches, right? A lot of people in this room actually teach this stuff. And I think there are two things that need to be taught in order to really move this thing forward. And one is very academic, so just bear with me for 2 minutes about it. And it is this idea of civil-military control of, this civilian control of the military, right? And this idea of Sam Huntington, everybody studied Sam Huntington and civilian, right? Okay, is dead. I mean, it should be dead. What we really need is more of the Hugh Strahan approach to civil-military relations. What I mean by that is, he wrote during Iraq, during OEF, and what he said was, let's not call it micromanagement military when the White House wants to know what you're doing, when the State Department asks what you're doing. That's the way policy will be made. We can only see as far as our headlights in this complex, highly politicized world. We can only see that far. Let's acknowledge it, and let's set up these feedback and these information loops, right? That's from the field, from the military. They are going to be the only people there sometimes. They are going to be. That's a fact, right? Let's acknowledge the fact, right? But let's have that feedback loop set up so that we actually can adjust policy just, as we get to the range of our headlights, right? So I think it's really important to start teaching that in our academic institutions so that the military and civilians are more accepting of it. Civilians know what to do with it. Military is more accepting of it. The other institutional training and education piece, I would say, is this idea of ends, ways, means. Now, people work for me and make me crazy with this idea of ends, ways, means. My colleague Rich is laughing. Military also. We have three very different takes between DoD, state, and aid on ends, ways, means alignment. So what I mean by that is that DoD is expert at it, right? We 27 years in uniform, do not accept the task, really. We define the objective and we narrow it till we can do it. So we have the tools and align the resources. The problem is, the military, in my opinion, does not speak up. When others pile on expanded objectives that the military does not intend to achieve, right? They must, I think, our leaders in uniform must speak up and say, I'm not going to achieve that, right? This is what I can do, this is what I cannot do. I can't have it piled on. USAID, tactically active. The military and aid actually have a lot in common. They get along much better than state, in my opinion, and the military. They do stuff on the ground. They create effects. Aid, I think, has a lot of work to do, frankly, with the alignment of ends, ways, and means. The objectives are huge. Peace and stability. These big development aims when we really were after security or national interest aims, right? So and I can give you examples. I won't do it. My big boss and my other boss are sitting here, and I cannot throw USAID under the bus too much. But you simply can't have these grand and glorious objectives with $20 million in this amount of time. It doesn't work. We need some discipline in aligning ends, ways, and means in USAID a little bit more. That's just education. These are super smart, super well-intentioned people, right? State Department fully understands it. Doesn't think they can do it, gives up. They must be the conductor. They must be the conductor of the art. They must develop the plan, even if they don't think it's going to work. So everybody has their lane they know to walk down, right? Okay, at the practical level. In in DC, I actually think that the State Department actually needs a body of people, and I think it's CSO that works for people, that actually enables the regional bureaus to lead the interagency in driving and making sure that the political holds primacy and that policy is set and adapted properly. I'm just going to leave it there. We can talk more about that later. And in the field, I think we need to use implementing partners more. I almost hate to say it, but from where I sit now, we have struggled to find civilians in government to deploy, to do these tasks of analysis and planning and reassessing and doing, right? I'm looking at Caitlin, who started the regional support team in East Africa for us. We could not find enough of the right people to do this. We can do this in the implementing partners. It's not preferable. I acknowledge that, but I think it's absolutely necessary, and I'm sure that we can do it and do it well. Okay, I will need some time back later. Okay.
Being the last of the first tranche, I'm sure there'll be some echoing of issues, but just to give everyone a perspective, so for the last year, in the military and the Army specifically, our branch commandants are responsible for a wide array of things, and so most recently I was responsible for essentially the institutional training of the civil affairs force in the Army. I didn't execute it. I wasn't down there taking people through obstacles or anything. But as we talked about, and then this moving forward, I think from a policy level, one of the biggest challenges we see is how do we incorporate our CivMil partnering from the tactical to the strategic at all ends before we actually have to implement it. And so what I mean by that is in the military, those of you that are familiar, we just don't say we're going to go do something. We tend to rehearse. We tend to check and make sure everybody has full canteens. We say, do you have enough ammunition? We do all these dry drills or everything before we actually go do what we're going to do, because we kind of want to have an idea what we're doing when we get there. Unfortunately, in my very limited experience understanding how it is, we tend to not do that in our partnering. One of the things I've seen some individual examples of it over time, but it's always been personality based. Tom Baltazar was very influential early on. When I went through my training, I had officers from USAID on my training when I was out at Camp McCall, Fort Bragg, and I was like, oh wow, that's pretty interesting. However, moving forward, all of this has been based on personality. There's no institutional policy, there's no institutional reform, and then when we decide to do it, if that person leaves, we don't have the policy, we don't have the institution, we don't have the mechanisms to go ahead and to continue it. So what happens is it goes away for a few years, and then we have somebody like Kevin who calls me on the phone and goes, hey, it'd be really great to train you guys. He comes by and talks to the commanding general of Special Warfare Center and School, General Sontag, and we say, yep, this would be a great idea. But 4 years from now, when our new officers are coming up through aid and state and the Army, is there going to be a mechanism for them to practice together? We wouldn't ask, well, maybe you would, and maybe the Jets would perform as well as they normally do. If we just asked them at the beginning of the year, don't play all year, we'll let you show up to the Super Bowl and we expect you to win. It probably wouldn't happen that way, but that's okay. They probably wouldn't win anyway, but I can say that. My wife's a fan, I'm not. But my point is that seeing this now from an Army training and institutional perspective, and seeing it also now in my new job as essentially responsible for 5 separate areas of responsibility and 5 different regionally aligned battalions, and essentially 83% of the entire active component civil affairs force, it's one of the things that bothers me. Because there's no way in the world I would ever send soldiers out to do something for the first time. We spend a lot of money, we spend a lot of time and resources to make sure they're ready, but what we haven't done is said, what are you going to do with your partners across the USG? And I understand all of those challenges because I've had those conversations not just with Kevin, not just with others, as far as finding the right person with the right personality, but just finding the right amount of resources to be able to do it with consistency and to create that kind of, as you talked about, the CSO, RST kind of climate, how that, we've done it on the ground, but it's been happenstance and force of personality that hasn't been institutionalized. And I think from my perspective, that seems to be one of our biggest challenges, because that's what I would like to see. So.
Thank you. And by the way, just to remind you, it's okay to speak openly. So.
Oh, okay. Well,
did we say shut him out? Sorry. So, you've already alluded to this, so I want to dig into it a little bit further. So one, the SAR brought the definition. The second thing the SAR brought was, come on guys, off the outside.
Roles and responsibilities.
There we go. Right? Roles and responsibilities across our interagency. And when we talk about civil-military engagement, we've done this. Whether it's CORDS in Vietnam, whether we were PRTs in Iraq and Afghanistan, whether we're trying to do stuff in Syria at the tactical operational levels. We've been doing this. It's been ad hoc. We sort of glue it together every time we need to do it. So if we take into account now the new framework, the new policy around, okay, here's these roles and responsibilities. What does that mean for the evolution of civil-military engagement and diplomacy?
Good. So on this round, I'm going to focus on the planning and assessment bits. I'll hit the deployment issues on the last round, but I want to focus on planning and assessment. But a couple of cultural points about the CivMil chasm culturally. And don't quote me. Put disgruntled bureaucrat if you want to tweet it. But if you ask a general, take a look at a plan. By the time she or he will have reached general, she or he will have seen hundreds of plans, if not more, and they will have looked very similar. By the time someone reaches ambassador or assistant secretary, she or he will have seen hundreds or thousands of things that are strategic, could be a plan, but they will not have looked the same. They will have looked very different, and there are different components. And so that's just the reality of us trying to cross the CivMil divide. There is not CivMil planning doctrine. We tried, it got resisted. But know that, and the question is, how do we find the best of good strategy and advise it? Also, don't quote me, you ask a general if he needs enforcements, and they say, why aren't they here yet? You ask an ambassador, would you like some help? They may likely say, I'm too busy to answer the question, let me answer you, and I've dealt with this crisis. It is a difference in the sense of help. And so, why are plans important? Because we have seen at the tactical level, when a civilian turns to their military colleague and says, I need to do X, Y, and Z, or I need support to get to X, Y, and Z, and the military commander looks at their mission essential task list, or the things that are prioritized, that commander says, I'm sorry, that's number 7, or that's number 11. You need to shape what is important as it comes down the planning and orders hierarchy so that you can empower the collaboration. That means that civilians need to go to where planning is taking place, whether it be a COCOM or a JTF, whatever. But that means that our military colleagues need to not trust Google as much as they do. I have seen in 5 shops at various levels Googling issues of governance. That cannot be acceptable. The teachers, the educators need to say, time out, turn, find your civilian counterpart to ask that question. We had the challenge and the pleasure of red teaming McChrystal's assessment in Afghanistan in 2009, and our basic message to him was, your capturing of the problem is nuanced and sophisticated, but it's been filtered through a planning process that now has a security line, a governance line, a development line. People take their chapters of the plan and run, and the beauty of a population-focused effort is lost when you split it into the different lines of effort. And we have to figure out a way to meet complexity with more nuanced and sophisticated ways to talk about what we're going to do. On the assessment side of the shop, one of the successes I felt like we made out there was we shifted the COAB from commander gets briefed by his or her team, diplomat sits at the side, whispers sagely into the ear. We shifted that to lead civilian, lead military, get briefed by their teams together. You force and incentivize how are we doing, what's our progress, what are we doing right and wrong. You force the integration by putting people's boss at the end of the table. That's the only way. When we talk about measuring our progress, we cannot do it separately. We have to force the fights and the arguments. Too often, we have a meeting in a theater once a week, once every 2 or 3 weeks. Everyone goes around a table, says their cliche. Oh, we need to show immediate effects. Oh, we need to deal with sustainability. Everyone gives their cliches. You go out, you meet 2 or 3 weeks later, everyone gives their cliches. We got to get past the CivMil cliches and really say, what are we doing in time and space?
Okay. So I'm going to address the planning piece and a couple other pieces. Well, let me get to that in just a second. While we look at this, part of what we do is, let's take, I own the doctoral program for CENTCOM as well. All humanitarian, anything stability, anything humanitarian assistance in CENTCOM to 20 countries for General Votel is under my purview at Central Command. Okay, it's all going to come under me. We've actually produced a white paper if you guys want to talk about the implementation strategy of the SARD, how we actually move forward. We built into the gray zone theory and how, based off what's happening in the gray zone, who would, based off permissive, non-permissive, and where we would impact. And so it's a sliding scale of how we would implement this, and we actually have a whole strategy built as well. And anybody wants it, please let me know. Well, part of that is building the metrics before we even do these disability activities. So in my humanitarian assistance program, for instance, we published each year, and we give it to DSCA, that each of the projects, so next year there's 120 just in Syria, for instance, we're proposing. So well in advance of this, it's what are you doing, what line of effort does this affect, what is the intermediate military objective, what are we trying to do when you target this? And then by doing that activity, when we come back around, did it actually help? Did we miss it? Do we have to re-engage? We do this with every part of that. So let's look at the U.S. and USAID. So they spent $1.7 billion in Syria last year. I spent $10.1 million. So let's look at the START reports in Karen Decker of where the targeted effects are, and especially who can do it up front in most vulnerable areas in some of those. So I'm more than happy to have that discussion. As far as planning, I have to adamantly disagree. First of all, the planning is by far when Sarah for Sarah Sewell. So when she was appointed by Obama and she was waiting on Senate confirmation, I was at the Navy War College. So she asked my help to put together a vision statement to put. And one of the problems she had in the State Department is all stovepipe, right? And she asked me, we're sitting there, hey, how do I get these people to work together to look at problem sets? They're always looking at countries. It's a very antiquated system. We talked about how to take Boko Haram, Al-Shabaab, look at a regional approach and make those and force the entities of the U.S. to work together. So where I get assigned to Special Operations Command, and at that time Sarah had been appointed, and guess who's the DoD component to look at that exercise? It was us. So what General Botel had said, okay, well, let's sit back and let's have the U.S. in the lead for planning. We don't want to do it for them. We had 6 different meetings about 3 months apart, and at the end of 6 months there was nothing planned. Couldn't get people to show up, couldn't get the planning done. So finally, right before, 3 weeks before the Sarah Sewell brief, we had to put that together and build that plan out. And then she's like, hey, here's how we do strategy. So when it comes to planning, we have to do that. It has to be effective. And again, a lot of times what's happened with DOS and USAID is they work with civil affairs forces that were in PRTs in Afghanistan and Iraq. Not one of those had an active duty civil affairs force. Not one. So if you work there, you don't know civil affairs. You haven't worked with a civil affairs officer that's reason aligned, language focused, and has degrees and everything in the region that they're working at. So if I look at Syria right now, the U.S. is doing 3-month rotations. USAID has people there, and I can name them. I can start naming them. And so a lot of those, for the USAID people in there, they brought one in from PACOM for 3 months. These aren't regional specialists who understand the problem set. In fact, with the Raqqa Civil Council, it was us that gave, here's the 109 members, here's who they are, their addresses, to put that out. So I think it's a bad characterization. And then the one thing I just want to put out there is 2 kind of points of interest, and then hopefully stir thought, is it is true, as DOD, we're moving quick. That's absolutely true. When the president turns to my commander and says, defeat ISIS in Syria, this morning when they say, well, we don't want to rush to failure, we'll think about who we work with, I'm told to defeat ISIS. So when I go through Manbij, August of 16, there's no help of who's going to put those civil governance in place. So we help put the civil governance in place. We go through Tashreen and Tafka and Raqqa. If it not had been for us after we had built over 8 civil councils, that's when they're like, well, hey, we may want to look at this. Their idea was to put the old Azad Council back in place out of Turkey. So we can't allow the reemergence of ISIS. So I understand what they're saying. And in a steady state situation, we've got to look at that gray zone theory. Where are we at in the gray zone theory? And then in a steady state, we're in Kenya, we're somewhere else. Absolutely. We work together. But Chuck Burnett in his new job now has teams in 52 countries that have to be operating in a VO area, a box, they have to be in that area. And to that disgruntled population that we're battling, and part of this SAR is changing the definition of stabilization through the range of military operations. So in social dynamic theory, everything begins with a grievance, and the population has a grievance, and if the host nation doesn't come and address that grievance, then it festers, and then you allow communists, radical Islam, all these different factors to come in, tribalism, to create, and it goes down the scale. And what's happened in the past is U.S. government doesn't want to address that to a certain level. What we want to do is say, no, let's have people who understand the environment, who's operating in the disgruntled area, who can identify the 16 polynomial factors, and be able to share that information with the rest of government, so we can come together and be able to look at that, do that problem set. And the last thing I'll say is, this is just to throw it out there, is as we identify what those stabilities are, they're different. There is no cookie cutter approach. But when we identify that, we got to make a decision as the U.S. government. Do I want to only deal with that will cause stability, or do I want to expand? So what happens is, if we go in Syria or Yemen and other places, if we want to do that function, that's fine. But if every time we go to a place and we will say, well, now that we're here, we're worried about child labor laws, and it matters about women's rights and how many representatives they have and these other functions, psychological functions, and we keep expanding that, did we change the original problem set that we identified early on? And I'm not saying it's right or wrong. I'm just saying as people who are academics, we have to actually look at that and address it, and it has to be in the conversation.
I'm going to start with saying I know that Tony did not mean the military doesn't care about women's rights.
No. Thank you very much.
The question about roles, who should do what going forward from the start, I think in Washington it's pretty important. And again, I will say again, I think the State Department has to lead that. I think there is no substitute. I think they do need to absolutely, so your comment about the ability to plan, there's more planning capability than you would think at first look. It does happen on occasion. And it does. It's just a matter of the stick-to-itiveness to actually to carry it through to the various levels of the White House meetings and to actually make everybody then swim in their channels. More capability has to be out of there, and I think it's absolutely important. In the field, I am less. I'm kind of more. So it's more with Jason on the planning and the criticality of it and who has to do it. But in the field, I am less married to who does what. I just think that the facts on the ground are gonna determine who has to do it. It's just gonna turn out that way. So we're kind of stuck in that regard. Having said that, I don't think there's a substitute for putting some kind of structure in place that makes sure that the civilian voice is heard. What is that? I don't know. That's our next question, right? Co-deployment and expeditionary. So I'll save. I have some thoughts on it. I'll save it for a little bit later. I do remember when I was a MILAD as a colonel to Ambassador Herbst, who was the coordinator in SCRS back then, right? And he said to me, he said, do you really think it's possible that a small number of civilians working with huge units and lots of military people, can we really have a voice? Are we really going to be heard? And, kind of in my, in sort of my innocence at that time, I said, absolutely, sir. We believe in civilian control of the military extended down to the tactical level where there's policy implications. So I say that, I don't think it's necessarily true. I don't think it's necessarily true. I think the military machine moves out to do exactly what Tony just said, which is get ISIS out of Manbij, defeat ISIS here, and we're not waiting for anybody. Right? So it's just the way it's going to be. Right? So what do we do about that? I think you got to have the right people embedded at the right places at the ear of the commander. It has to be an agreement made at the very top. Right? And we also have to understand, I think, you don't need large numbers, but what you do need, let's keep our eye on the ball here. The end is not to have civilians forward or to have civilians doing what we do, just because we don't want the military to do it. Right? That's not the end we're after. Right? The end we're after is achieving our policy aims and understanding that the political thing is at the center, and the military is not typically good at doing that, with the exception of the civil affairs, both on my left and my right, who, in my opinion, do not represent hole of the military. That's the problem, right? Our civil affairs officers, it's a little bit different at CENTCOM. Sometimes you have just a little bit of education, a lot of you know this, but sometimes you have a warfighter who's got all the stuff on their uniform, like these gentlemen. They have a lot, they can have the ear of the commander, they can speak their language. If you don't have that, civil affairs and their knowledge and expertise about how to do some of the stuff that they actually can do in consultation with civilians, it's just, that can work. Other times it simply doesn't work. So that we have to have the right civilians embedded at the right places, the right access agreement at the top. Right. I'll leave it at that for now.
So, just touching on a few of the themes that were taken in, and I thought about this earlier as far as roles and responsibilities when we were talking about kind of the conflict between CT and stability operations. And we were talking about the military and the kind of can-do as Tony's example of ISIS, and I was thinking back to some experiences, and so I think, quite frankly, when the military is the happiest and when the rest of the USG is happiest is when the military supports humanitarian assistance, disaster response. And why is that? And this is one of the battalion commanders who's sitting next to me kind of brought it up, and I was like, that's a pretty good observation, because what is it? It's save lives, immediate human suffering, get it done fast, and now get out of here. It's perfect. So if we go back now, I'll pull back on Cotter and say, well, it's all about culture, right? It's all about culture. So let's look at military culture. Let's look at the rest of the culture across the Interagency Unified Action Partners. Whether it's state, aid, it doesn't matter. And now we're looking at a more protracted approach. We're talking about a foreign service officer who's going to live in that country and be concerned about what happens 10, 15 years from now. Is that NCO or officer? I'm not sure. At least writ large. And to Kim, to your point, as far as the value of the capability, well, that's pretty obvious. Over the last decade, every service has essentially abdicated the capability except for the Army. And even then, the Army has made the decision that we're going to be focused where we are focused for those reasons. And so that's kind of the sine wave of history of the civil military operations in the military, based on, we're having that conversation earlier. And so what are the roles and responsibilities? Well, I think we've kind of outlined them a little bit. Where the ground and the dust and the boots and the blood and the guts and all those things are where, that's absolutely the military's role. But guess what? The certain distinct capabilities, they're the eyes and ears. And those are your civil affairs teams. Regardless of component, the baseline capability of conducting civil reconnaissance and civil engagement, that's the baseline. And what they do from there and who we partner with is going to, again, to my previous point, based on the networks and relationships and how we trained together previously, will then generate that engagement and be able to actually perform the duties we're asking them to do, inform decisions that need to be made from the right lens and from the right passion.
Hey, Kim, can I just one thing.
30 seconds.
30 seconds. With the planning that I talked about, when we talk about the integrated country strategy, the CDCS, and the TCP, those three elements, where I think we need to go, kind of goes to the first point, is above that. That's what I do now at the country team level. If we really want to be good and we really want to implement the SAR, then before the ICS and CDCS and TCPs are made, we're planning together, we're integrated together, and we know what the policy is so that we're unified before we write these plans.
And so, just a 2-point on that. I mean, the challenge is an ICS is not a campaign plan. A CDCS is not. It's not about synchronizing in time and space. And so I think we need to get better at process of motivated and synchronizing in time and space. And a fact check on the Boko Haram point you made. 4 months after the Chibok girls incident, Sarasota presented to deputies a whole government plan, and the strategy was not inside out, because our partners in Nigeria aren't there yet. It's outside in, go regionally. That plan had quarterly reviews, and so there was an example of where planners stepped up, supported P, supported J, brought in the Interagency. So it's doable, but it takes the system to evolve, and we're not there yet. I think part of the beauty of this panel is where we have been and where we are, and I'm all about where we could be. There's a lot of reforms necessary, and to the point about expeditionary, your last question.
I haven't asked you that.
All right. Reading your mind. We're running out of time, man. Do you want to ask me?
Well, because I want to contextualize it as well, but no, the eagerness is
awesome. Contextualize it.
But I will point out, by the way, that we would not be having this panel 15 years ago, and I think just to note that we actually have this dialogue right now is already pretty evolutionary in my book. So, but 18 months ago, I was asked if I would do a guinea pig assignment with USAID out in Kuwait to be embedded with the Special Operations Joint Task Force for Syria and Iraq, so OIR. So I said, sure, who doesn't want to go to Kuwait, especially to June? So went out, and I have to say some of my best conversations were with you, Colonel Thacker, because we did not agree on some things, but that's okay, right? The idea was, how do we figure this out so that we are aligning our resources jointly and capable of actually seeing a common operating picture and all of that jazz. But let me tell you something else that happened. 5.5 months. That's how long it took me to get lodging on Camp Arifjan. As a U.S. government civilian, I could not get lodging on a U.S. Army installation. So, what does that bring us to? Expeditionary co-deployments. So, when we talk about co-deployments, this is, again, nothing new. There's nothing in the SAR that says, hey, this is brand new, guys, we've got it this time. We've got a lot of hurdles to deal with when it comes to doing the things we know work. And co-deployment, as recommendation number 4 stipulates, is one of the things we know that works. However, there are a lot of hurdles in order for us to make that effective. And learning from SCRS and the Civilian Response Corps through the State Department, we had to actually look at that in detail for this recommendation and understanding what it means to do effective co-deployment. And we're still looking at what that means. So I'll turn it over to you to tell us, how do we make a more effective co-deployment?
Remember, it's attributed to a disgruntled bureaucrat. This is not our first rodeo. When SCRS trebled the length of the security training for civilians, the system said, so, that doesn't give you new ability to go to different places or new risk management. QDDR1, so we need to think about risk different. QDDR2, so we need to think about risk different. The redesign said the same thing. We had a past, fairly recent secretary that would start senior meetings, are all my people safe? That is a good question, but we all signed up to serve our national interest. So starting the conversation with are my people safe misses the point that if we are there to do important things in service of national security, we're there voluntarily. Some people won't, but we are there. Anyone that joined the job. So I think there is a push, and the SART is a part of this, the latest version. How do we think about risk management versus risk avoidance? We put civilians in South Sudan in hooches on World Food Program sites after a lot of prep and study and assessment and planning and thinking about redundancies. It is doable. But the challenge is, in the context of START or START Forward, have we done this before? It's asked across the, have we? Yes, we've done it before. But the SAR says, pay attention to when you've done it before, institutionalize it, create processes. The same thing with Libya. Haven't we done this before? Yes, we've done it before. We've learned things, but they don't have a place to sit yet. We haven't found that. And so that is the key on one part, but also we can't be in the game of gotcha. ARBs, accountability review boards, are murder for any career. And so the question is, how do you look at it from risk management, not getting caught up in a game of gotcha, so that we can be present, so we can be there.
Thanks. So I want to start off by saying that we have very few people from State Department and USAID in Syria, to give an example. But my boss fought hard. First of all, he talked directly to Kerry, John Kerry, at first, and that wasn't going to happen. We had to wait for things to change over. But that's how important it was for him to make sure civilians were on the ground with us. We want them there. I'm a firm believer, and let's figure a way to do that. So we have them on the ground. They want to go every single place we are. I'll tell you, they have great attitudes, and they want to assume the risk. Right now, it's not up to them. If it was up to them, they would be there. It is the diplomatic, the DSS, the security services that prevent them. They're the ones that are supposed to, whether I'll allow you to go or not allow you to go. But a lot of credit to the men and women on the ground from the US and USAID that want to be out there, with our team. So as we look at this problem set, I think that we should look at it in a way that says, my guys in Yemen, I'd love nothing more than to have you guys in Yemen right now. I mean, we're the ones doing the Port of data assessments of what's happening, and we want you there. My boss, and of course, Lieutenant General Promotable Brown, he gets 4-star here. He'll be here tomorrow to talk, and he wants as many on the ground as possible that risk allows for, and we will provide the security, we will provide the logistics, because we think it's that important. And so I'll stop with that and saying that as we come together for that last part to how do we move this forward, you have at least my boss's backing to make sure we do that. And if we get into a place where GS and third partner contractors, because OFDA, Office of Foreign Disaster Assistance, is really all contractors, or 90% of them, then we got to look and say, is there another function that we can, a contractor partner that has the trust and confidence that they can go do that for us, that doesn't have the restrictions on them? And that gets to the, how do we go from here? So I think we got to put all this together, options, to put them on the table and not worry, like Kim said, not worry who gets credit for it.
If I may ask a question, if General Brown is able to do that, will he be authorized to pay for that? Do you know?
Which part are you talking about?
The civilians and providing, housing, securing.
So right now,
care and feeding those.
are you talking about GS and third country? So
Yes,
right now,
in Yemen, if you're allowed to take as many civilians as can go, is there any congressional restriction or authority on paying for that, or is it all have to be
so right
reimbursed?
now, if we look at what we have in Syria, because that's a good one to talk about, we fund all the logistics, all the security, everything comes from us. The movement, we did a separate exec sec memo signed by the Secretary of Defense to be able to move them with helicopters and everything like that. So we've incurred the cost of that. It's not reimbursable or non-reimbursable.
So that process was a 12-month process.
It was,
So-
and
So is that
Kevin, you did a great job.
institutionalized now? That's institutionalized now?
That institutionalized for that one.
For that
one place.
It's not global.
Okay.
But to plug, because
Okay.
I know my OSD colleagues will absolutely want me to do this, but the Defense Support to Stabilization that was discussed this
Yeah.
morning
Yeah.
by Dazzy Swain, that is leading towards funding that can support civilian deployment.
No, that's great. Because my comment was going to be back to when I was in CSO as a DAS and trying hard to embed a civilian in the SOCC in N'Djamena and Chad, which we did, sort of too. Actually ended up being housed more with the country team. But his actually place of duty was with that SOCC in N'Djamena. It's no longer there. Because we knew that the special operations elements were all over the Lake Chad Basin, and we needed to understand, civilians needed to understand the political situation on the ground. The intent was to spread to Maiduguri and into Cameroon, and never got there, right? But there was a memo, so again, it was a memo, it was signed by individuals who feel strongly about it, and it's really interesting that people at the top, our leaders at the top, in this case it was Assistant Secretary Linda Thomas Greenfield and General Rodriguez, who was the AFRICOM commander, who agreed, had a memo signed saying, I'll support, care, feed, not clothe, care, move around these civilians as you desire. And I'll tell you what happened. Every single time a person wanted to move, the lawyers in AFRICOM said, whoa, we must take a look at this again and see if we have to be reimbursed, see if it's actually safe enough, if we really want to incur this risk. So even though we had this umbrella agreement that was hard fought, it was still very difficult to actually, in each movement, in each instance, actually make that an effective mechanism. So it's really great to hear that I was behind, so I just wanted to hear about that we have in fact made progress, and that's a good news story. The next step will probably be institutionalizing that, and I think that there are, the oversight committees, they have brains. They're actually, I think we have to speak to them more about these success stories, and about what the executive agencies want, and I think the State Department, who does very little dialogue with the Hill, has to do more of it. Has to actually carry that ball forward with aid by its side. So I think that really is the future. I think we all have examples of each that worked or didn't work so well. We all know it has to be done. Having said that, again, I'll repeat the thing that sometimes we don't need to have a civilians stuck right in the middle of the place where the firefights are. They cannot move around. Nobody can move around that well, right? Nobody can get to go where they want to be. We know that in uniform, right? So again, I think we need to keep our eye on the ball, what we're trying to achieve. We're typically trying to achieve understanding of what requirements have to be put in place so we can communicate back to Washington resource requirements and policy input. Right? So what does that mean? There's other ways to do it. Implementing partners know how to use host nation officials. Right? We know we're getting much better with information analysis and gathering information from remote sources and data collection. There's other ways to do this kind of thing. I know that isn't exactly the question you were asking us, but I would encourage us to keep our eye on the ball on what we're trying to achieve. Secondly, I would say in those cases where you have semi-permissive hotspots of non-permissive, but your broader area of operations is not all non-permissive, you can actually put in place civilian networks. And again, we tried to develop something at Creative. We tried to develop this model for the Philippines. And actually, when we presented it to PACOM and to State and Aid, everybody sort of liked it and said it needs to be a regional. Right? It was a CVE. Right? How are we going to contain the spread of violent extremism, given all that's going on? The idea was to have, using host nation partners, using one headquarters where you would have analysts and planners, the regional support team in East Africa model, but sourced, right? You would have embeds in each of the embassies in the region. You would have embeds with the local security forces. It would be a network spread out that comes back together. So, and this is the critical point with this, I think, and I forget who hit on it earlier. This idea that when we come together as an interagency, as civil and military decision makers, we're there to make decisions in good measure, but all we end up doing in many cases is sharing information. We use this precious meeting time to share information, just exchange information. Great, and we're all a little bit smarter. And we haven't done anything with that information. So how do we move forward to actually presenting at the time of the convening a common operating picture and real recommendations? We can get there. We can get there with the right people forward, using the right information management system backbone. I really think it's possible, and I think that needs to be the future. So because some of this co-deployment thing, some of these are it's just going to be really hard for too long.
Not to, just real quick, because I think a lot of the issues and the challenges, but just as the perspective. Right now, the Army, Air Force, and Marine Corps are implementing a new concept called multi-domain operations, essentially as we're looking across the spectrum. We've all heard kind of the narrative as far as decentralized, more degraded, more uncertain, all those things. And so understanding that stability is a political endeavor, understanding that risk will be a political risk, and that will drive everything. I think we just have to mitigate that risk through ends, ways, and means. That's the other piece, is that imbalance of ends, ways, and means is where you accept risk. And so what are we asking, what are we trying to do, with what, and with whom, and how? So if we have a small cadre, maybe it's from an RST example or something, those are the right people. Maybe they've been specially selected and trained to go do what they're supposed to go do, based on what their specific skill sets are. But maybe that's what it is. And I know you and I have had that conversation. Maybe it's not so much a wholesale. We don't say that's wholesale in our military. Maybe we don't say it's our wholesale across our government, the rest of the USG either. So just as a perspective.
Thank you, panelists. We have 5 minutes, but we also have a 30-minute coffee break. So what we'll do, there are 4 panelists. Let's do 4 questions. We'll do them all at once, and then afterwards you guys can join the panel for coffee. So I see 1, 2, 3, and 4. Okay, starting over here.
Yes, okay. Good afternoon. My name is Joanna Brown, and I came up from New Zealand for the conference. I'm very happy to be here. I spent the last 10 years doing stabilization planning with the Marines and the U.S. Army. My question is, will the SBATs be stood up to do stabilization planning? And my second question is, I literally just got an email from the Marines at Bagram, and they CC'd the USAID rep. They're looking to do this. I trained them in Germany before they went, and they're circling the wagons, trying to figure out how how can we get some funding for stabilization activities? So I put that out there. Any suggestions?
So as far as,
Well, let's get all of them and then we'll answer if that's okay, Pat.
okay, great.
Louis Rasmussen with Thacker. I'm interested in hearing anybody's perspective on DODI 3000.5. And it was updated just last year. It's being updated again. Speaking of roles and responsibilities, how is this going to unfold in relation to the SAR? And how will that likely provide authority for DOD to do things forward when the civilians aren't there?
For those unfamiliar, 3000.05 is the stabilization doctrine for DoD. Sorry, I don't remember. Yes.
Yes, I'm Selena with Hayes Group International. I've worked with AFRICOM and South Africa and a lot of silos. I mean, it's hard to get them to AFRICOM to walk down to 3304, the building. But also siloed with the knowledge that each ambassador through those 54 countries in Africa had jurisdiction in that one country. So I'd like to get your view on how do we allow for information to move between a TSOC, the COCOM, and State Department, where we're more effective in our programming, particularly around I/O because it moves so quickly. Having worked in that area, coming up with narratives, I mean, those narratives change like that, and we're just not there yet.
Absolutely. The last one, Kevin.
Kevin Brownwell, USAID. I've worked on stabilization issues kind of in the interagency here in Washington as well as in theater. I don't have much hope for changing things for the better here in Washington. The NSC system existed since the 1940s. But I'd like to get your views. Earlier, Kevin touched on the question of CRTs versus cords and so on this question of gets to synchronization. Coordination, as it exists now and as it has existed for the last 15 or more years, where we all sit together in a room and have many information discussions and no decisions are being made, or very few of them. Do we have a coordination structure at the tactical level, or should the U.S. government move to an integrated structure of civilians and military in the same chain of command, so you will have civilians and military often supervising each other in this important kind of hybrid civil area of stabilization?
So since Jason already knew what questions were going to be asked, we're actually going to go with the last. Let's start with you.
Okay, so just I'll run down a few, give my perspective. So as far as SFABs with planning, I don't think we really know yet. I think as that continues to develop, the capabilities, understanding that this is kind of a one and done for a lot of those other people going to that organization. And so I think the Army's still trying to figure that out. I think we are trying to figure out roles, responsibilities, and there's a lot of overlap right now with other ends. I'll be quite frank, with a lot of things that maybe civil affairs, PSYOPs, and everybody else are currently doing with theater security cooperation, but no one seems to have too many issues with that. So, with regard to 3000.05, the DODI is continually being updated again, and my perspective is that it doesn't matter if it's updated if commanders aren't reading it. It doesn't matter if I'll be honest with you, it doesn't matter if it's not integrated to professional military education, and that they recognize that it's an inherent responsibility of all military operations and actually apply it. It's in our doctrine, Field Manual 3.0, the Army just released. It talks about stability mechanisms. It talks about offense, defense, and stability simultaneously, the simultaneity of that happening. But it's what are the priorities for our military, at least for the Army right now. If you look at the cross-functional teams, they're all systems-based. There's the network, but it's not, you can't attribute a single one of those maybe to stability unless you talk about the compel stability mechanisms of threat or use of deadly force. And so that's my perspective, and my opinion only, not an official position. Africa silos, I don't have enough experience, but I think in general, There have consistently been silos across the TSOCs, the GCCs, and Department of State for information. There are a lot of mechanisms that I've seen used. There are informal networks. I think it's the formality of that. And again, I think even in exercises and war games, the Army's challenged with that and how they share. I mean, the fact that they can run a certain scenario and not realize that their special operators are already there. In those countries, executing on behalf of the Theater Special Operations Command, I know that's not just only in one area, and it's across all of them. So, and then I'll just stop there because I think we can talk about board structure at tactical level and chains of command forever. Let my other panel members opine on the rest.
I'll just say two. I won't talk about SFAB, but did we ever define SFAB?
I'm sorry, we did not.
Security Force Assistance Brigade for those who know it. It's a long time coming as an Army thing. It was a long time coming. I won't touch that once I'm dated on it. I'm happy to talk about where I think it should go in the break. 3000.5. I think any hope for real adherence to, paying attention to any of this doctrine might come in the new multi-domain battle concept, which talks about competition. And it largely has to do with major regional powers. It's the disruption Russia causes in Ukraine. It's major powers creating facts on the ground in other states that then are destabilizing. And I think that the place that's relevant to other civilians in the room and implementing partners as well is how do you compete for influence in those places? How do you help create stability, which is not necessarily a military task, although there's probably a discussion to be had in the Pentagon about military support to civilian partners again in those kinds of areas, because that's frankly, as we were saying, has the Pentagon's attention now. I think that the question about the stovepipes in AFRICOM, that's a tough one. We've been burned by that. Civilians get burned by that. They listen to the TSOC commander, and the combatant commander says, "What the heck are you doing?" Right? And said, and you feel like saying to the combatant commander, "He works for you. You know, get him in line." Right? It doesn't happen necessarily for many reasons. But I think that Kevin's question could provide the answer to that. And I'm totally with you. I think there should be an integrated command. We've talked for a long time about unity of effort versus unity of command, but I think there's no substitute for unity of command, right? No substitute for it. And in fact, it's not such a far-fetched idea. Even the Hill, when I was at State, we went over and we spoke with, and I forget the staffer now, but, who said, frankly, we're thinking about that. We're thinking about a super-empowered civilian, probably an ambassador in the critical country in a conflict-affected region, or the Boko Haram in this case. We're thinking about that. A super-empowered envoy who would then command and control all of the assets that are required. Now, nothing happened with that. That was a couple years ago. It's really hard. Why is it hard? Because money doesn't flow that way, right? It doesn't flow that way. But the fact that everybody recognizes it is a hopeful thing, and I think there is no substitute, it would solve a lot of those kinds of problems.
The SFAB, Security Force Assistance Brigade, stability plan, I would say no. So they've actually asked me to come on August 4th to actually talk about this in particular. So the first SFAB is deployed to Afghanistan. And directly from them is, we're here to train and advise for kinetic effects. And so part of the Southwest Asia strategy is to now gain 80% of the population, to put them under government control, to help push out and do these different tasks. And yet when I talk to them and says, hey, is JAROA now set up to establish for the line ministries and be ready? They've already identified the DCOPs and the different people to move in there. There's nobody doing that function. And so that's a gap that's there right now. And so, and to your Marine question, I have a Lieutenant Colonel Charlie Brown who's out there as the J9, and put him in contact with him. He can contact me. I have civets with him every 2 weeks. And some of the things we're talking about is how do we combine a couple programs with aid and what we're doing, and maybe even use our CERT dollars, which is appropriated to help that program, and especially a neighborhood program that they're operating in. 3005, I would just go with what my friend Chuck Burnett said, and that is that commanders are not going to look at 3005. They're going to look at if it's 3.0 or 5.0. But I'll just tell you this, the number one challenge, and I said this when Ann Witowski was the DASD, and we had lunch together, and I said, the problem with this is, I know you want to call it stability because of SHA, but every commander who's been through the advanced course, the CGSC, Command General Staff College, war colleges, all the military training is going to say stability is after you break something. It's phase 4. And you will have a massive re-education process because people just don't get it. You're going to have to, it's going to take a long time to say, hey, this is preventive strategy. How do we do predictive analysis to get this disenfranchised population? It's just going to be hard for them to conceptualize that. They're like, yeah, after this is over, then we'll worry about stabilization. And that's going to be the mindset. Africa, TSOC, concur. That's an ongoing issue. I think that's with everyone. But I do think that in CENTCOM we've created a civil information integration cell. It's a branch that I have. And the key is to take all the information we have and get it to the right people. So we produce lots of documents. I can talk about each country in the Middle East in detail. We produce products with that. And to our partners, if you need something, we want to get it to you. We want to make sure that we provide that to you because it's like that secret squirrel. If you're holding information to yourself, it's not very valuable. One of the things we did early on in the Mosul conflict is we produced products that Rob Jenkins had on his desk every single day. He said it was the most instrumental product that he had because we were bringing multiple entities or data to come together to produce it. And then finally, the last, I would just say that we should look at, in my opinion, it goes back to the second question, is you identify those co-deployment people early so they know. It's not like you guess in case of a problem. You know you're physically fit, you're whatever the requirement is for that co-deployment status, the training level. You're a T, you're trained at that. And then, but I also think it should be at the higher level too. So right now at CENTCOM, I have USAID people in my office. We have the POLAD's office, and I talk to them all the time from State Department. And so when we're looking at a problem set, and I bring it to General Hotel, I talk to both of those entities in a problem set. Now that's not where we need to go, but if right now a humanitarian crisis happened, we have Yemen, 29 million people, 8.4 million are stage 4 hunger, stage 5 is famine, 1 million cases of cholera. If that were to transition, U.S. has no interest in Yemen as a government. They want to stay out of it, as you know, the senators and the congressmen. But if 8.4 million people went to starvation, guess what? We're going to get the call. And that's an example of where, as we establish a joint task force together, there's no reason that we can't have a senior civilian that's already ready, knows the planning process, knows where to put everything in a strategic context that can work with DOD to be the JTF commander or co-commanders, whatever the case is.
Just want to rip real quick
Oh,
on
sorry
what
about
Tony
that.
said about the HA piece. And, we've done that in the past. With Ambassador Luck in 2010, we put JTF 80, but there were also, having been on the ground, there were a lot of challenges there too. I mean, who was actually in charge? It's a good question. So, we've done it in the past, we have experience, but I think realizing it and actualizing it is a lot harder.
So I'll just focus on Kevin's question. And there's a lot of different PRT stories. There's a Iraq PRT story. There's Afghanistan and all the different myriad versions in Afghanistan. If you haven't read it, John Ackery has a great piece about all the effort was to put into creating a civil partnership, and by the time that was in place and stuff was delegated and powered down, policy pulled the plug, and we're not doing stabilization, we're doing transition. It's just, if it takes that long to set up these partnerships and then you pull the plug, that's just a recipe for failure. So for me, the step before you get to unity of command is no kidding, have we empowered people at every echelon? Do they have decision-making authority? Do they have the resources under their control? Can a diplomat speak for the power of the U.S. government when talking with his or her counterpart? Can they bring that to bear? Because that's nothing to sneeze at. To say that I speak for the ambassador, he speaks for the president of the United States. And so I just think before we get to unity of command, we just have to make sure that we're doing what we need to do, which is empower folks to actually do their job, as opposed to putting them out there and saying good luck with that.
So I told you at the beginning you were at the best panel. You know why. Hopefully it was entertaining and informative. I do want to say that one of the reasons it is the best panel is because now the tough work begins, and that's why you're here, is because we have to actually implement this thing. And it's not going to be easy, and we may turn to you at times, if not all the time, to look for solutions. So start brainstorming, talk to us. We want to be in touch with you. That's why hopefully we will all succeed, and it's rising tides for everyone. That's right, all the ships. There you go. Thank you.
Great.